My name is Emily. I'm 28. And in my family, I've always been the one who learned early that silence was easier than being honest. That night started like every other family dinner was supposed to: one table, one meal, and the unspoken rule that no one should rock the boat. It was the first time my sister brought her new boyfriend home, and my mom made sure everything looked perfect. The food was warm, the smiles were practiced, and the tension sat right under the surface. At first, it was just small talk. Then my sister laughed and said I was too sensitive. She followed it with a joke about how I didn't handle pressure well, then added, still smiling, that I had a habit of making things awkward without even realizing it. She said it casually, like it was charming. The table laughed, not loudly, not cruelly, just enough to make it clear they agreed. I kept my hands folded, said nothing, and felt my face heat up. My dad stared down at his plate like it held the answer to something. My mom finally looked at me and said, "Stop making the family look bad." So I did what I'd always done. I stayed quiet. I let the moment pass. I let them move on. That's when my sister turned back to her boyfriend and started talking about his job, proud and confident, sharing details she clearly thought made him impressive. I didn't interrupt her. I didn't react. I just listened. Because sometimes staying quiet isn't about keeping the peace, it's about waiting long enough to understand what you're really hearing. And before I go on, if you've ever been the person at the table trying not to cause trouble just by existing, consider subscribing. These stories don't always end the way families expect, but they end honestly. That dinner was only the beginning. The drive home felt longer than it actually was, not because of traffic, but because my mind slipped back into a pattern I knew too well. In my family, things had always worked a certain way, and I had learned that early without anyone ever sitting me down to explain it. My sister was the one people made room for. Her moods were treated as signals, her reactions as something to accommodate. When she spoke, the conversation adjusted around her. If she interrupted, it was confidence. If she pushed too far, it was passion. I watched that dynamic form when we were young and solidify as we got older. Whenever something tilted unfairly in her favor, I was the one told not to make it a big deal. If I looked upset, I was reminded that she didn't mean it that way. If I reacted at all, even calmly, the focus shifted from what was said to how uncomfortable I was making everyone else feel. Over time, I stopped questioning whether something was fair and started asking myself how much noise it would cause if I spoke up. My mom framed it as guidance, always calm, always reasonable. She would pull me aside and tell me to be understanding, to be patient, to let things go. She never said my sister was wrong. She said my sister was stressed, sensitive, dealing with a lot. The responsibility always landed on me to absorb whatever tension existed so it wouldn't spread. If I resisted even slightly, I was told I was escalating things. Peace became something I was expected to maintain, not something we shared responsibility for. My dad rarely stepped in at all. At first, I thought that meant he was neutral, but silence has a way of choosing a side without announcing it. When conversations turned sharp, he focused on his plate or changed the subject. When things grew uncomfortable, he left the room. Nothing was ever resolved, but nothing exploded either, and that seemed to matter more than balance. The message was consistent even if it was never said out loud. Conflict was worse than inequality. Speaking up was more disruptive than being overlooked. If I wanted things to stay calm, I needed to stay quiet. That rhythm followed us into adulthood. Family gatherings didn't change, they just became more polished. The words were sharper, the smiles more controlled, but the structure stayed the same. My sister filled the room without trying. My reactions were monitored. If I disagreed, I was told to relax. If I pulled back, I was called distant. There was no version of me that fit comfortably unless I stayed agreeable and out of the way. Over time, silence stopped feeling like a decision and started feeling like a reflex. I learned how to listen without reacting, how to let comments pass without settling anywhere, how to keep my face neutral even when something landed wrong. It wasn't strength or patience. It was conditioning. It was understanding that in my family, calm came at the cost of my voice, and that cost was expected, not discussed. By the time I pulled into my driveway that night, I wasn't replaying specific moments anymore. I was recognizing the familiar shape of it, all the same imbalance wearing a new situation, and how easily I had slipped back into it without thinking. The next morning unfolded like every other workday, steady and familiar, which made it easier to pretend nothing had followed me home from the night before. I arrived at the office, settled into my chair, opened my email, and moved through the early hours on autopilot, but the rhythm didn't quiet my thoughts. The way my sister had talked about her boyfriend's job kept replaying in my head, not the teasing this time, but the confidence in her voice when she listed what he did. The specific terms she used, the casual way she framed his work as impressive and important. At first, I tried to dismiss it as background noise, the kind of information people repeat when they want to sound informed, but the more I replayed it, the harder it was to ignore how familiar it felt. The field she described overlapped too closely with files I'd handled before, projects that had crossed my desk precisely because they required scrutiny, not admiration. That recognition alone didn't mean anything, and I told myself that repeatedly. Industries overlap. Language gets recycled. Patterns don't automatically signal a problem. Still, the discomfort lingered. During a quiet stretch of the morning when no one was hovering nearby, I opened an old folder from months back, not with the intention of proving anything but simply to ground myself in facts instead of impressions. I skimmed documents I hadn't touched in a long time, reminding myself of the scope, the terminology, the frameworks involved. Nothing jumped out immediately. There was no obvious wrongdoing, no clear confirmation, but there was enough similarity to make me pause. It was subtle, the kind of thing you could easily overlook if you wanted to, and that realization unsettled me more than finding something concrete would have. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen, aware of how this would look if anyone knew what I was doing. In my family, context rarely mattered. If I raised a concern now, it wouldn't be received as neutral or professional. It would be framed as personal. It would sound like jealousy, like bitterness, like I was trying to diminish my sister's happiness the moment it took center stage. I could already imagine how quickly the narrative would turn, how my silence at dinner would be reinterpreted as passive aggression, how any hesitation on my part would be used as proof that I'd been holding something against her all along. At the same time, the alternative pressed just as heavily. Closing the folder and walking away wouldn't be a neutral choice either. It would be a decision to ignore something I recognized well enough to know it deserved attention, simply because addressing it would be uncomfortable. I told myself that if there were truly an issue, someone else would catch it, that it wasn't my responsibility to intervene, that staying out of it was the safer option. The logic sounded reasonable on the surface, but it felt thin even as I repeated it. This wasn't abstract anymore. I was looking at information I understood, information that sat in a gray space where intent and impact didn't line up neatly. The conflict wasn't dramatic or loud. It stayed contained, internal, pressing in from both sides. Speaking up risked turning me into the problem again, the one accused of stirring trouble, of refusing to let things be. Staying quiet meant choosing comfort over clarity, choosing the familiar ease of silence over the discomfort of acknowledging something that didn't sit right. Neither option offered relief. Neither felt clean. I scrolled for a moment longer, then realized I wasn't absorbing anything new. My thoughts weren't moving forward, only circling the same two outcomes without resolving them. Finally, I closed the folder without saving changes, shut my laptop, and stood up from my desk. I hadn't decided what I was going to do. I hadn't committed to speaking or staying silent. I had only accepted that the line between minding my own business and ignoring something wrong was thinner than I wanted it to be, and that understanding followed me out of the office as I walked away. By the time the next evening settled in, the discomfort I carried no longer felt emotional. It felt structural, like something that could be measured if I chose to look at it the right way. I didn't want comfort or reassurance, and I didn't want someone telling me I was justified. What I needed was distance, the kind that removes personal history from the equation and leaves only what can be examined without bias. That was why I called Nicole Shaw. I didn't frame the situation as a family issue, and I didn't mention my sister or the dinner. I described the facts as neutrally as possible, focusing on scope and context rather than intention. Nicole listened carefully, then asked questions that avoided motive altogether. She didn't speculate, didn't sympathize, and didn't minimize anything. Instead, she outlined what could be verified legally, what information was publicly accessible, and how those checks were typically handled when emotion needed to stay out of it. She was clear that she wasn't drawing conclusions for me, only pointing out a process that existed precisely to separate concern from assumption. When the call ended, I didn't feel relieved, but the problem had taken on a clearer shape. There was now a distinction between what felt wrong and what could actually be confirmed. Later that night, I contacted Samuel Knox, someone who had dealt with related material before and understood the professional landscape far better than I did. I kept the conversation narrow, asking about precedent and publicly documented issues rather than current individuals. Samuel didn't ask why I was interested or try to guess my motivation. He responded the way professionals do when the subject is familiar directly and without drama. He confirmed that similar operations had raised concerns in the past, issues that were recorded and accessible to anyone who knew where to look. Nothing he mentioned relied on insider knowledge or private access. These were matters that already existed in public records, quietly acknowledged, but not widely discussed. He didn't exaggerate the implications or suggest outcomes. He simply confirmed that the concerns were real and that they weren't new. When we hung up, the quiet in my apartment felt different. It wasn't heavy or overwhelming. It was deliberate. That was when the weight of the situation shifted. Until then, I could still explain my hesitation as personal sensitivity shaped by family dynamics and old patterns. Hearing the same issue reflected back through people with no emotional stake stripped that explanation away. This wasn't about jealousy, rivalry, or resentment. It wasn't about proving anything or settling a score. It was about information that stood on its own, independent of who was connected to it. That realization didn't create urgency or fear. It created caution. What I was dealing with wasn't explosive, but it was tangible. And tangible problems don't disappear just because acknowledging them is inconvenient. They exist whether you choose to speak or stay silent. I went back through the material again, slower this time, separating what was documented from what was implied. The emotional noise that had followed me since dinner finally quieted enough to let the facts sit where they belonged. I wasn't looking at a theory or a secret. I was looking at publicly available information with consequences that extended beyond any one relationship. That distinction mattered. It meant this situation couldn't be contained within family boundaries or resolved through private conversations. It existed in a space where pretending not to see it didn't make it disappear. By the time I closed my laptop, the question in front of me had changed. It was no longer about whether I was misreading the situation. It was about whether continuing to treat this as a personal matter was still honest at all. The second family dinner took place the following weekend, presented as casual, but arranged with the same quiet intention as always, and from the moment everyone sat down, it was clear that the balance in the room had already shifted. Ashley arrived confident, not trying to impress anymore, because she didn't need to. Zachary at her side, composed and agreeable, the kind of presence that naturally drew approval without demanding it. Ashley talked easily, sharing details about his work and their plans, framing each story in a way that placed them firmly at the center of what mattered. Zachary followed her lead, offering just enough insight to sound important, while letting her control the narrative, smiling when attention landed on him, comfortable in his role. Patricia encouraged the momentum without being overt, guiding the conversation toward image connections and how families are perceived through the company they keep speaking, as if these were neutral observations rather than values being enforced. Her tone was calm, measured, and confident, the kind that discouraged interruption by sounding reasonable. I listened quietly, noticing how naturally the discussion organized itself around Ashley and Zachary, how little effort it took for everyone else to fall into place. As the conversation shifted into what Patricia clearly considered serious matters, future opportunities, social circles, people worth aligning with, Ashley turned toward me with a mild smile and suggested that I handle the dishes, explaining that the discussion was becoming more complex and probably not something I needed to be involved in. She didn't raise her voice or mock me. She spoke as if she were stating a simple fact, something obvious that required no debate. Patricia didn't stop her. She didn't even acknowledge the comment, continuing the conversation without a pause, which made her silence louder than any agreement. Brian stayed quiet, eyes lowered, his stillness blending into the background as if remaining neutral were the safest position available. No one looked at me to see how I would respond, and that absence of attention said more than any insult could have. The expectation was already set, and it was shared. I stood there for a moment, long enough to recognize how quickly the room accepted my exclusion, how easily it became normal. I didn't argue or ask for clarification. I gathered the plates and moved toward the kitchen, aware of how seamlessly the conversation resumed once I stepped away. From the sink, I could hear their voices soften and lower, shifting into a tone that suggested this was the conversation they had been waiting to have. They weren't being hostile or cruel. That was the part that made it unmistakable. They were being efficient, arranging the space around what they valued and who they believed belonged in it. As I washed the dishes, I thought about how many times I had mistaken this pattern for keeping the peace, how often I had convinced myself that silence was a form of maturity rather than compliance. Standing there with the sound of their voices carrying easily from the dining room, that belief finally collapsed. Silence in that moment was no longer a way to avoid conflict. It was a way of allowing it to settle into a permanent shape. When I returned to the table, no one paused to include me. No one explained what I had missed. I took my seat and listened, watching the dynamic unfold without trying to interrupt it. Ashley spoke with growing assurance, Zachary responding smoothly, Patricia reinforcing the direction with subtle approval. The structure was clear, stable, and unchallenged. I didn't confront it, and I didn't retreat either. I observed it without the filter of habit or hope, seeing the roles as they actually were, rather than how I had once explained them to myself. The dinner ended politely with familiar goodbyes and reassurances that sounded sincere enough to pass, but the meaning of the evening had already settled. Silence had stopped being about keeping the family together. It had become a decision about where everyone stood. The shift didn't come with raised voices or sudden anger, it arrived quietly, which made it impossible to ignore once it settled. Ashley continued talking, confident and composed, expanding on Zachary's work, as if repeating it would somehow reinforce its legitimacy. She spoke about responsibility, influence, long-term impact, framing everything as solid and respectable, and the table followed her rhythm without question. Patricia nodded along, adding small affirmations that sounded like pride rather than inquiry, while Brian remained silent, his presence passive, his attention drifting but never intervening. I waited until Ashley finished, then spoke evenly without changing my posture or tone. I asked one short question, whether she was sure she wanted to keep talking about this subject. It wasn't a challenge, just a pause. For a moment, the table hesitated, surprised more by the interruption than the question itself. Ashley laughed, brushing it off easily, saying there was nothing to worry about, and nothing she couldn't explain. Her confidence wasn't defensive. It was casual, almost inviting, as if transparency were a position she could afford to take. That response removed the last reason to hesitate. I reached for my phone, calmly unlocked it, and opened a file I had prepared earlier, made up entirely of public records and official disclosures. I didn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing or imply intent. I explained briefly and clearly what the document showed, outlining timelines, filings, and connections that existed independently of my opinion. I spoke slowly enough to be understood, but not slowly enough to invite interruption. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. Zachary's expression changed first, the ease he had carried all evening tightening into something restrained and uncertain. He shifted in his chair, opened his mouth as if to speak, then stopped, recalculating. His eyes flicked to Ashley, then to the phone, then away again, as if the room had stopped behaving the way he expected it to. Patricia tried to regain control, asking what this was supposed to mean and why it was being brought up now, but her words didn't interrupt the momentum. Once the information was on the table, it moved forward on its own. Ashley leaned in, scanning the screen, her earlier confidence thinning into confusion. She tried to dismiss it, suggesting it was being taken out of context, then tried to explain it away, but neither approach landed cleanly. Each attempt only highlighted the gap between what had been presented and what she had assumed everyone would accept. Brian finally looked up, his silence breaking not with words, but with attention, as if he were seeing the situation clearly for the first time. No one raised their voice. No one insulted anyone else. That restraint made it irreversible. The facts didn't need emphasis or commentary. They sat there unadorned, altering the shape of the conversation without asking permission. Ashley attempted to redirect, saying this wasn't the place for such discussions, but the suggestion arrived too late to matter. Zachary tried to speak again, then stopped, realizing that anything he said would draw more focus rather than less. The silence that followed wasn't passive or awkward. It was dense with recalculation. Every person at the table understood that something fundamental had shifted, not because of confrontation, but because the room could no longer pretend it didn't know what it now knew. I didn't push further or wait for acknowledgement. I set the phone down and stopped talking. There was nothing left to clarify. The moment of choice had already passed, and the evening had crossed into a space where neutrality was no longer possible. The conversation didn't resume its earlier rhythm. It fractured into pauses and unfinished thoughts, each person adjusting to the reality that the story they had accepted without question no longer held together. That was the point of no return, marked not by drama, but by the quiet understanding that the version of events everyone had relied on could no longer stand. The fallout didn't arrive as a single event. It spread gradually, moving through professional and social spaces the way doubt always does, quietly and without permission. Nothing was announced, no statements were made, but the tone around Zachary's work changed almost immediately. Calls that used to be returned the same day were delayed, meetings were rescheduled without clear reasons, and a collaboration he had described with confidence was suddenly labeled as pending further review. The language was careful, wrapped in courtesy, but the meaning was clear enough. Trust had been interrupted, and once that happened, progress slowed on its own. Zachary didn't argue or push back publicly. He became more cautious, less visible, aware that any attempt to defend himself would only draw attention to questions no one wanted to ask directly. Ashley felt the impact in a different way. Her social circle didn't confront her or demand explanations. They adjusted. Invitations stopped coming. Conversations that once felt warm became brief and polite, ending quickly, as if everyone were suddenly busy. Messages were read but unanswered. People who had once sought her presence now avoided extended interaction, not out of hostility, but out of calculation. She wasn't treated like someone who had done something wrong. She was treated like someone who carried uncertainty, and uncertainty made people uncomfortable. The confidence she had worn so easily at the dinner began to fracture, replaced by irritation and restlessness she couldn't disguise. Patricia responded the only way she knew how, by managing appearances aggressively. She canceled a gathering she had insisted on hosting, then quietly declined several others offering excuses that sounded rehearsed. She spent long hours on the phone trying to steer conversations away from anything that might invite follow-up questions. The harder she worked to control the narrative, the more obvious it became that something was being avoided. Inside the family, nothing softened. No one reached out to apologize or acknowledge how events had unfolded. Conversations with me became transactional, stripped of warmth, and focused on containment. Patricia asked what I had shared and with whom, framing her concern as protection for the family rather than responsibility. Ashley oscillated between anger and denial, insisting that the situation had been blown out of proportion while demanding to know why I hadn't stopped it sooner. Brian remained silent, but his quiet no longer felt neutral. It felt like withdrawal. The absence of an apology wasn't accidental. Apologizing would have meant admitting that their confidence had been misplaced, that the image they relied on had cracks they never wanted to see. As days passed, fear replaced outrage. Every phone call carried the possibility of being questioned. Every social interaction felt like a test. The family became preoccupied not with what was right, but with what might be exposed next. They monitored reactions, read between lines, and avoided spaces where explanations might be required. I watched this from a distance, not intervening, not clarifying, because there was nothing left to clarify. The information existed independently of me now. It moved according to its own logic, shaped by how people respond when certainty dissolves. I wasn't blamed directly, but I wasn't included either. Forgiveness would have required reflection, and reflection was a risk they weren't willing to take. What stood out wasn't the professional setbacks or the social isolation. It was the fact that concern never once shifted toward truth or accountability. It remained fixed on image, on how things looked, on the fear of being asked to explain what could no longer be neatly packaged. In that silence, the family revealed more than they ever had through words. They weren't afraid of what had happened. They were afraid of being seen clearly. The request came without urgency, which made it more revealing than if it had been desperate. Patricia asked to talk, choosing her words carefully, framing it as a conversation meant to calm things down rather than address anything directly. She didn't ask how I was doing or acknowledge what had unfolded. She went straight to the practical concern, saying the situation had become uncomfortable, that people were speculating, and that it would help everyone if I could step in and smooth things over. She didn't suggest anyone admit fault. She didn't mention responsibility. She spoke about optics, about how long these things linger when no one intervenes, about how families protect themselves by closing ranks. The word she kept returning to was help, as if the issue were a mess that needed tidying, rather than a consequence that needed to be faced. A little later, Brian said something similar in a quieter way. He didn't argue or defend anyone. He suggested patience. He said that staying quiet a bit longer might let things fade, that silence had always worked before, that pushing now would only make everything harder. He spoke as though time were a solution instead of a delay. Neither of them asked whether anything that had happened was wrong. Neither acknowledged how long silence had already been expected of me. They weren't looking for understanding. They were looking for containment. Listening to them, it became impossible not to see the pattern clearly. They weren't distressed by what had been exposed. They were distressed that it had become visible. The problem wasn't the truth. It was that the truth now existed outside their control. Everything they said circled back to image, to how things looked from the outside, to how exhausting it was to feel watched. In that moment, the role I had been assigned in the family finally lost any remaining ambiguity. I had never been valued for clarity or honesty. I had been useful when my silence absorbed discomfort that wasn't meant to be shared. That realization didn't arrive with anger or sadness. It arrived with precision. When I responded, I kept my voice steady and my words brief. I didn't explain myself or outline boundaries. I didn't recount events or defend my decisions. I said one sentence clearly and without emotion, that I wasn't responsible for protecting anyone from the consequences of choices they were willing to stand behind. I didn't wait to see how it landed. Patricia tried to respond immediately, shifting from measured to insistent, reminding me that families don't fracture over situations like this, that walking away would only make things worse. Brian looked uncomfortable, as if hoping I might soften, but neither of them offered accountability. They wanted closure without ownership, calm, without correction. I stood up, ended the conversation, and left. I didn't suggest space or future conversations. I didn't promise time would help. I cut contact cleanly and intentionally. Calls went unanswered. Messages stayed unread. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final argument, no emotional collapse. There didn't need to be. The decision wasn't fueled by resentment. It was based on clarity. Staying connected would have meant continuing to carry consequences that were never mine to manage. Walking away wasn't a punishment or a statement. It was alignment. There was no reconciliation because there was nothing left to reconcile. What remained wasn't love damaged by conflict, but a structure built on silence, and once that structure was visible, there was no reason to keep standing inside it. Thank you all for taking the time to watch the video. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming videos.